All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. You ready?
Sure.
All right, yeah. Andrew, here we go. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited today to have as my guest, Andrew Susskind. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right. So Andrew is a licensed clinical social worker, brain spotting and somatic experiencing practitioner, as well as a certified group psychotherapist. In 1988, Andrew completed a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst before transitioning to the West Coast. After completing a Master's of Social Welfare degree from UCLA in 1991, he worked with individuals, couples, families, and groups in his practice. Speaking, writing, and training are dimensions of Andrew's ongoing desire to learn and grow. He's given numerous presentations and workshops, both nationally and locally in Southern California. He was adjunct faculty in the UCLA School of Medicine doctoring program. Andrew has mentored associates in his private practice since 1997 and serves as faculty for the Principles of Group Psychotherapy course, a prerequisite to becoming a certified group psychotherapist. His recent book, It's Not About the Sex, Moving from Isolation to Intimacy After Sexual Addiction, joins his workbook, From Now On, 7 Keys to Purposeful Recovery, which was released in 2014. So you are one busy guy.
This is true, yes.
All right, welcome. Before we get going, Andrew, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently. And then we'll dive in.
Sure. I'm originally from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. And I've been in Los Angeles since 1988. I'm currently speaking to you from Santa Monica.
All right. East Coast, baby. I went to school in Philadelphia, so very familiar with Cherry Hill.
Excellent.
All right. So, look, let's just cut to the chase here. How did you get into this field? What drew you to become a therapist, to specialize in trauma and addiction and sexual intimacy and so forth?
Great question. And I answer this in a way that might sound like I'm joking, but I'm not. I believe that I became a therapist in utero. And what I mean by that is that I was born into a family with a lot of problems. And even though I think we all loved one another, we had trouble loving one another. And I was the fourth of 4 boys and very competitive, envious, controlling kind of household. Parents were not happy. I never saw a whole lot of affection at home. So really the relational trauma was really what I was part of from the time I was born. So in a way, my mom gave me a gift because she brought me into the world, and I was the mediator, I was the problem solver, I was the rescuer, and I think that I was destined to eventually put that into use in my professional life. And obviously, I try not to save or rescue all my clients, but I had a lot of good training in my childhood.
At what point, did you realize this stuff had happened to you and was traumatizing or had impacted you, and you needed to maybe get some help in a sense?
Well, it's a great question as well. What I would say about that guy is when I was in junior high and high school, I was the one that my neighbors' moms would come to. They would come to talk to me. And I didn't quite understand it at the time because I was pretty young, but I was an awesome listener. And so I was kind of like the neighborhood go-to counselor. And what happened was I didn't know what trauma was at the time, of course, but when I went to college and then grad school, I learned that really what happened in my upbringing was very different from what happened in many other people's upbringings. And that I really learned how to overachieve. I learned how to be a perfectionist. Eventually, I fell into sexual compulsivity, which was my way of trying to cope. But what happened with all of that, to answer your question, is I think I learned about trauma in my personal experience, of course, but then in academics, I realized, wait a second, this whole idea of trauma is really talking about me and my own history. And the way I define trauma is that it's anything that happens to us that's too much to process at the time. And I had a lot of stuff that happened to me as a kid that was way too much to process at the time. And so cumulatively, it resulted in things like sexual compulsivity and like I said, perfectionism, overachieving, my own tendencies to save, rescue, be very codependent. And then eventually, of course, through my own therapy, I started to understand what my role was in all of that and how I had been really trying to survive some very complicated situations, both as a kid and as a young adult.
At what point, Andrew, did you say or realize, I need to get some help. I need to see a therapist?
My first experience was in high school. And the reason at the time was because my family was falling apart and I was having trouble concentrating at school and I was getting depressed myself. And so my parents did have a belief in therapy, thank goodness. And they brought me over to Philadelphia to see a really good therapist. And it was such a relief because what she told me was, this is really understandable. This is really normal for a kid to become depressed after all this stuff has been going on for so many years. You've been holding it in, and then finally your system really just gave out.
So at some point you go to school, you decide you're going to be a therapist. Take us there.
Sure. I'll tell you a quick story about that. So my dad's sister is a psychologist here in Los Angeles. And when I was living on the East Coast, I really saw my LA family as, they were just the coolest family ever, right? Because they lived in Venice and they went to the beach, and it was just very idealized at the time. My aunt and I've been very, very close to my aunt from the time I was a little kid. And she's one of those people really who was a resource for me from early on. And I was very impressed with her because she divorced my uncle and she started a private practice in psychology in the Valley. And she was just doing her thing and enjoying her profession. And she talked to me about it. And I thought, wait a second, I kind of do this already, like I said. And she said, well, why don't you check out the MSW program at UCLA, because it's a 2-year commitment. You can see how it goes and go from there. And so she really was the catalyst for me to go to grad school.
So you go to grad school, and at what point did you realize you wanted to specialize or had a special interest in sexual intimacy, trauma, et cetera?
Another interesting question, Guy, because back in 89, 90, 91, we didn't talk a whole lot about trauma. Just wasn't part of our language. We never talked about the nervous system, which is fascinating to me that 30 years later, we know so much about the nervous system. And so what happened really was I knew I was going to focus on mental health. I mean, I knew I was going to become a clinical social worker. That was my direction. But what happened was I ended up, shortly after I finished grad school, I was hired as an associate in a private practice that was seeing people out of rehab. In other words, some of the treatment centers like Betty Ford and Sierra Tucson and the Meadows that have been around a long, long time were part of what they were connected to. And they would see clients that were coming out of rehab. They were considered post-rehab specialists. Mm-hmm. And there I was, this young guy out of grad school, and they really were fantastic in helping me understand the dynamics of what's really underneath addiction, which is brokenheartedness. And so from way back then, I knew that it wasn't just a behavioral thing. It was something about mending broken hearts. And I've taken that with me all these years because it's so poignant and it's so true, because it talks about attachment ruptures. It talks about difficulties with love and intimacy. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about compulsive sexual behavior or we're talking about substance use disorders. All of the addictions are based in something that was missing, and something that was longings really and desires that went that kind of went without being satisfied.
I noticed you said brokenheartedness. You didn't say trauma. You said underlying, and that's very interesting to me. And it brings with it much more depth and weight and clarity to it. Say a little bit more about that.
Sure. They're very similar, but let me just talk about the different types of brokenheartedness for a moment. So when I think about brokenheartedness, I do think about trauma. So it could be specific or developmental or relational trauma. Can be a type of brokenheartedness. But if we think in larger terms about things like grief and loss and different types of abuse and abandonment, they kind of go together, but I steer away from diagnostic labels if I can. I think they're helpful between clinicians, but not in general. And so brokenheartedness, what I think about is that we all have it. And isn't our job in life, hopefully, to work towards a whole heart, right? A cohesive story of who we are and what matters most to us. So that's just a little bit about brokenheartedness. Yeah.
Okay. So let me just reintroduce you here. I'm talking with Andrew Susskind. He is a licensed clinical social worker. His book is called "It's Not About the Sex: Moving from Isolation to Intimacy After Sexual Addiction." So at what point did you say, all right, I'm going to write this book. I'm going to write this specific book?
Sure. So I went into my own recovery back in '94. I went to my first 12-step meeting for Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, was the 12-step meeting. And I've been in the 12-step world as a participant, as a sponsor, as a sponsee, all that time. So I say that because I really want to acknowledge that there's been a professional experience and a personal experience. And what happened was I was actually working with a coach many years ago. And she was very inspirational in helping me look at my strengths and what really mattered to me. And one of the things that matters to me that I've never really looked at until I spoke with her was teaching and sharing knowledge, right? And so we were sitting down and having a brainstorming session, and she said to me, well, if you could write anything, what would it be? And the first thing that came out of my mouth was, I just want to help people with their brokenheartedness. And so that's where the first workbook came from now on, 7 Keys to Purposeful Recovery. And the book recently, the book, It's Not About the Sex, really came from, how can I put this, a moment where I said to myself, what do I want to write about? And how disclosing do I really want to be? And what I sometimes say, Guy, is it could have been an autobiography, but I'm not quite that narcissistic, so I chose not to make it an autobiography. But I thought to myself, what isn't being talked about in the 12-step rooms? What isn't being talked about in the therapy rooms?
Okay, hang on. So let me just interject here. So what
Please.
isn't being talked about in the 12-step rooms?
Right. So when I say that, what I'm really referring to are things that aren't being talked about in depth. So for instance, emotional sobriety gets talked about, but it doesn't get talked about in depth. Shame, narcissism, grief, regulating the nervous system, cultivating joy, boundaries, codependency, right? Those are the kinds of themes that have been explored in my book. And the reason why I wanted to go more in depth with them is because I felt like there was just something missing in terms of the conversation that was really instrumental in helping people have sustainable sobriety, right? It's one thing, stopping a behavior, but to really have a life that's satisfying and fulfilling and meaningful is a whole nother story. So that's really the trajectory that I went on.
So all those words are, in a sense, kind of buzzwords. I mean, we talk about them and you're saying, well, let's really kind of unpack them, explore them. And similarly, you said things weren't being talked about in the therapy office. The same list in a sense, or what?
The same list. And I'm not saying that every therapist misses all of that. But there's only a select few folks who really focus on long-term recovery from sexual compulsivity, right? Because that's really my focus is, and this is really the personal piece, is it's one thing stopping the behavior, but it's another thing really having something to live for. Like what gives me a reason to wake up in the morning? And so part of what I've learned through the years is there's the healing piece of what do I need to heal from? And then there's the present tense piece of how do I help regulate my nervous system so I can tolerate what life is all about? And then what is it that's really going to be fun and pleasurable and going to give me a therapeutic direction that's going to be sustainable? So it's kind of like past, present, future. But I think because mental health professionals as a whole are not always well versed in addiction in general, but certainly sexual addiction, it's complicated, right? I think it takes a certain kind of therapist to really explore all of those issues.
When you talk about sexual addiction and you mentioned sexual compulsivity, are they the same, or is sexual compulsivity a type or form of sexual addiction?
Great question. So sexual addiction was the term given to us back in the 70s and 80s by Patrick Carnes. He's the pioneer of sex addiction. More recently, the term that's been accepted by the World Health Organization is compulsive sexual behavior rather than sexual addiction. And so because I've been around a while, I still use the term sex addiction, but I actually believe that compulsive sex is a little more descriptive and a little more accurate. So they're kind of the same thing, but I never want to pathologize sex, and I never want to use only the medical model, which is what addiction is often looked at. And so sexual compulsivity or compulsive sex is really, I believe, it's really a way of looking at it that's more holistic and less diagnostic.
When we talk about addiction and the various types of addictions, and then when we talk about sexual addiction, and you're working with people who are coming to you for this sexual compulsivity, let's say, and can you generalize in what the people who are experiencing sexual compulsivity, is there across the board? And I know, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing how difficult it is to generalize, but
Yeah.
is there a brokenheartedness behind all of that?
So this is the two-sided answer to that. Yes and no. There are situations, I'll give you a quick example. You can have a teenager who falls into pornography and becomes compulsively using pornography, who may not have brokenheartedness in his background, but his brain was basically hijacked by these images, and he becomes sexually compulsive, right? But I would say that, and there's research that goes on out there that might answer this question even more specifically, but I believe that the majority of folks with some kind of compulsive sexual behavior have some type of brokenheartedness in their past. That if I scratch the surface on somebody who comes in with some kind of compulsive sexual pattern, that underneath, first of all, is going to be an intimacy problem, some kind of intimacy issue, and behind that, some kind of brokenheartedness and or trauma.
What do you feel, Andrew, is your specific, unique gift in this area as a therapist? Is it what you bring personally to the table? What is it when you're working with a client?
Sure. So one thing I believe wholeheartedly is that as much as I know, I don't know. I come from a place of really wanting to be as curious as possible and as non-judgmental as possible and as compassionate as possible. I never want to make an assumption based on somebody's behavior, who they are, what they've been through, or what they need. So from the very beginning, I try and have an open heart to find out what is their story and what is their brokenheartedness, and in a sense, how can we collaboratively decide what their therapeutic direction is going to look like. So all I can say is I've been around the block a long time, both in the 12-step rooms and as a therapist. And I really feel like what most people say to me is they just feel heard, they feel understood, they feel like they can say anything to me, and that I'm really going to hold it with a tender glove, right? I'm not going to, I'm not someone who's going to tell them what's right or wrong or how to do it, or I'm not a homework kind of therapist. I'm more a space where someone can be fully themselves.
Well, all of those are awesome. They're like the kind of gold nuggets of therapy in a sense, but with the understanding that people evolve.
Yeah.
Was it always like that for you from the get-go as a therapist?
I think I had a lot of those ingredients which were developed in childhood. But the thing that I didn't say that I'd like to add to this is I've also done a lot of training with the nervous system, as a somatic experiencing and brain spotting practitioner. I very much believe in mind, body, and spirit. And that the nervous system has so much to offer us. It's so informative. And I used to try and be a effective therapist without having that training, but I always ran into walls. And so as things have unfolded, I think what I bring to the table is also being able to work with the body, help my clients understand what's happening in their body and in their nervous system, and to release, to find ways of safely releasing the trauma and finding ways to regulate their nervous systems. It's a beautiful thing.
We've had, I've had David Grand on here.
Oh,
For those listeners out there who aren't familiar with brain spotting, what's the kind of nutshell description that you could all share?
Well, it's like a cousin of EMDR. So if people know about how EMDR is using the eyes and using bilateral movement of the eyes, that's where actually David Grand kind of bounced off of. But basically, if you think of bilateral movement as back and forth, what he does is he finds a particular spot and he helps the client process from that particular spot. So that's what he calls a brain spot. So it's much more in depth than that, of course. And I encourage people to go to brainspotting.com if they're interested in learning more about brain spotting. But it's a way of regulating the nervous system. It's a way of releasing traumatic memories that are stored in the subcortex. And I believe it's a very elegant and respectful approach. I really, it's changed my practice for sure.
Wow. What kind of inspired you to get into that, to study that?
I had colleagues who had gone through the training, and what happened, Guy, is their practices changed, but more importantly, their nervous systems changed, because as part of our training, we get to do the process on one another, right? That's part of how we learn. And so I saw that something was different in some of my really terrific colleagues. And I always take that as a sign that that's something that I want. And so I followed in their footsteps.
Wow. All right. So, man, you've got a lot of information going on here. What would you say there to the listeners out there who maybe don't know a lot or enough about sexual compulsivity in terms of maybe educating themselves? Of course, they can pick up your book, and we'll talk about your book in a minute. But what else would you offer in terms of resource for them?
Sure. There's many good books out there, but the ones that I happen to recommend the most are the original book by Patrick Carnes, which is called Out of the Shadows. And even though it's from the mid-'80s, it still holds up. It still has some nuggets that are really helpful, especially for someone trying to address and learn about what that's like, either for them or for their clients. Another one that came out a while ago around pornography, because as we know, pornography and compulsive porn is so rampant, is called The Porn Trap. And it's by Maltz, Maltz, and it's a couple that wrote The Porn Trap. Terrific book. There's lots of other books as well. My book is really geared more towards longer term sustainable sexual sobriety, but I've had feedback that even folks who are new into acknowledging their problem are really getting something out of it.
Awesome. All right, Andrew, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Sure. Easiest way is through my website, which is westsidetherapist.com. That's all one word, singular, Westside Therapist.
Okay.
And you can contact me through the website. You can check out links to my blog, my podcast, anything else that you might want to learn.
Okay. And share the name of your podcast.
Of course. Yeah. It's called It's Not About the Sex.
Okay. And what's that about?
It's right. It's really about sexual compulsivity, but more specifically about how do you live a bigger, more satisfying life once you have gotten away from the dangerous behaviors.
Awesome. All right, Andrew, man, loved it. Love to have you back at some point, and just appreciate you and you sharing your journey and your personal experience. And it's inspiring to hear someone like yourself talk about how you've been able to take that and share your knowledge and your gift and your heart with the people you work with.
Thanks, Guy. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
All right, man. We'll be in touch.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.